Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are exploring a subtle psychological pattern that affects far more people than they realize. It is something that often appears harmless, even positive, yet it has the power to weaken ambition, drain motivation, and quietly interfere with personal growth. The topic is simple: why keeping certain plans to yourself can sometimes be one of the smartest decisions you make. There is a strange moment that happens when you tell someone your plans. At first, they smile, nod, and offer encouragement. Sometimes they even seem genuinely excited for you. But after that conversation, something begins to change. The energy fades, not suddenly, but quietly and almost invisibly. Most people never notice it because they assume danger always looks like opposition. They expect resistance to arrive loudly and openly. But human psychology rarely works that way, especially when ambition is involved. The moment you speak your future out loud, it no longer belongs entirely to you. Part of it enters the minds of other people. Part of it becomes exposed to judgment, projection, comparison, doubt, envy, and expectations. You believe you are sharing motivation, but psychologically, you are inviting observation. And observation changes behavior. Have you ever noticed how certain goals feel more powerful before you tell anyone about them? Before the announcement, before the opinions, before the need for validation? There is a unique intensity in silence, a hidden fire. Then one day, you tell people about the business you want to start, the physique you want to build, the channel you want to grow, or the life you are trying to create. And afterward, something feels weaker. Not because the dream changed, because your mind changed. The human brain often struggles to distinguish between actually achieving something and receiving recognition for planning it. The moment people praise your intention, your brain experiences a small psychological reward before any real work has been completed. Gradually, discipline begins to dissolve into fantasy. This is why some people become addicted to talking instead of building. They mistake expression for execution. But words create emotional relief, while action creates transformation. Those are two very different things. Most people never realize how much of their ambition escapes through conversation. Every time they explain their next move, they unconsciously seek reassurance. Does this sound impressive? Do you think I can do it? Will people admire me if I succeed? The problem is that once your vision becomes dependent on social approval, it stops being fully yours. It begins belonging to the crowd, and crowds are psychologically unpredictable. They support you when your dream feels interesting. They question you when it starts becoming possible. And they often resent you when it begins becoming real. People rarely resent your weakness. What unsettles them is the possibility that you might outgrow them. That is the uncomfortable truth few people say out loud. Growth changes social balance. The quiet person becomes disciplined. The insecure person becomes confident. The overlooked person becomes respected. And suddenly, your evolution forces others to confront their own lack of progress. Most human beings avoid mirrors that reveal uncomfortable truths, especially living ones. As a result, resistance often appears in subtle ways. Not direct sabotage, psychological friction, small comments, casual doubts, jokes disguised as concern. Are you sure that's realistic? Don't get carried away. You've changed lately. What they often mean is something much deeper. Your transformation is making them more aware of themselves. And awareness can be painful, especially for people who survive through distraction rather than growth. The strange part is that many of them genuinely believe they are helping you. Human beings are not always conscious of their deeper motives. Hidden insecurities often reveal themselves through ordinary behavior, not through villains, not through enemies, through regular people, friends, family members, partners, and sometimes even through yourself. Most people imagine betrayal as something dramatic, a clear attack, an obvious insult, or a visible act of disloyalty. But psychological resistance rarely arrives in such an obvious form. More often, it enters disguised as ordinary conversation, and that is precisely why it is so difficult to recognize. Someone asks about your plans with what seems like genuine curiosity. You explain everything: the strategy, the timeline, the vision you have been carefully building in your mind. And afterward, something unusual happens. You stop moving with the same intensity. Not because anyone cursed your future, not because someone sabotaged you, but because part of your attention quietly shifts from creation to performance. Instead of building in silence, you begin imagining how success will look in the eyes of others. Your relationship with effort starts changing. The goal becomes social. The work becomes a performance. You spend more time fantasizing and less time acting. This is why some people spend years talking about becoming powerful, successful, or disciplined, yet their lives never truly change. They feed themselves with an imagined identity instead of an earned one. The brain enjoys symbolic progress. A person announces they will become disciplined. Others admire their mindset. The person feels inspired and elevated for a moment, yet nothing has actually happened. No sacrifice, no difficult mornings, no lonely evenings, no painful repetition, only words. And words are one of the cheapest sources of emotional reward. The ego often wants recognition before it has earned it. That impulse quietly destroys potential because premature exposure weakens internal momentum. A seed grows underground before anyone sees it. There is wisdom in that. When fragile ambition is exposed too early, it becomes vulnerable to external influence. Doubt spreads quickly through social environments, especially subtle doubt, a disappointed expression, a delayed response, a sarcastic laugh, a slight change in tone, small things. But the unconscious mind absorbs them all. Human beings are deeply social creatures, even those who consider themselves independent. Most people underestimate how strongly their nervous system reacts to the emotional atmosphere around them. That is why certain environments can slowly suffocate ambition without ever openly attacking it. You can feel it. The invisible pressure to remain familiar, to remain predictable, to remain small enough that nobody around you feels uncomfortable, because whenever someone genuinely changes, they disrupt the emotional balance of their social circle. The overweight friend begins training seriously. The quiet person develops confidence. The financially struggling person becomes focused. The people pleaser learns boundaries, and suddenly the entire group dynamic starts shifting. People become uncomfortable when your actions expose the excuses they hide behind. Kindness without boundaries teaches people how to use you, and ambition without silence teaches people where to attack you. Some attacks are obvious, most are not. Sometimes people drain your energy through endless questions. Sometimes through negativity disguised as realism. Sometimes through constant opinions. Sometimes through emotional guilt. You think you're better than us now. That simple sentence has destroyed more potential than failure itself. Human beings often fear social rejection more than mediocrity. Even highly ambitious individuals secretly crave approval. And when approval begins conflicting with transformation, many choose approval without realizing what they are sacrificing. This is why silence becomes a form of psychological protection. Not secrecy driven by fear, not paranoia, but selective invisibility, a refusal to allow unfinished parts of yourself to become public entertainment. Because once people know your plans, they stop relating to who you are and begin relating to who they expect you to become. Some want you to succeed because your success inspires them. Some want you to fail because your struggle comforts them. Some simply enjoy watching. But very few understand the true cost of becoming different. The loneliness, the obsession, the uncertainty, the version of yourself that must disappear before a new one can emerge. Real transformation is rarely motivational. It is uncomfortable. It is disruptive. It is deeply internal. At some point during every meaningful transformation, you stop feeling completely understood by the people around you. Not because they dislike you, but because they still relate to a version of you that no longer exists. And this creates a strange psychological divide. Externally, everything appears normal. You still answer messages. You still show up. You still speak the same language. But internally, something has shifted. A quiet detachment begins growing. You notice that conversations which once entertained you now feel repetitive. Certain friendships seem built around familiar complaints rather than growth. People discuss the same problems year after year without any real intention of changing them. And eventually, you realize something unsettling. Many people do not actually want solutions. They want familiarity. They want routines that keep their identity intact. Predictable suffering often feels safer than uncertain transformation. Once you understand this, human behavior starts making far more sense. You begin seeing why people unconsciously resist change, both within themselves and within others. Change threatens identity, and identity feels like survival. Human beings naturally create social masks that help them function within society. The problem begins when the mask becomes more important than the truth underneath it. That is when people stop asking, "What am I becoming?" and start asking, "What version of me will be accepted?" That is where self-betrayal quietly begins, not through one dramatic decision, but through countless small compromises, laughing at things you no longer find funny, hiding ambition to avoid judgment, downplaying intelligence to remain likable, explaining yourself to people determined to misunderstand you. Little by little, authenticity gets exchanged for social comfort, until one day, a person wakes up feeling disconnected from their own life. Most never understand why, because they were taught to fear rejection more than emptiness. The unsettling reality is that society often rewards this behavior. People who remain predictable are easier to manage, easier to categorize, easier to control, but individuals who begin thinking independently create tension wherever they go, not necessarily through words, through presence. A disciplined person reminds others of their lack of discipline. A person with strong boundaries reminds others how much disrespect they tolerate. A person moving in silence creates uncertainty because nobody can measure them anymore. And silence has a unique effect on human psychology. In a world obsessed with constant self-disclosure, silence feels unusual. People share everything now. Every idea, every emotion, every temporary desire. Yet the more people expose themselves, the less psychological power they often retain. Mystery creates tension. Predictability removes it. The person who speaks less frequently appears more powerful, not because they are superior, but because the human mind naturally projects depth into what it cannot fully access. That is why silence changes social dynamics. Some people become curious, some become suspicious, some become intimidated, and many will try to provoke explanations from you. Not because they care deeply, but because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. And when people can no longer clearly read you, they often begin revealing far more about themselves than they ever intended. That is when the masks begin to slip. The jealous person suddenly becomes overly critical. The insecure person starts mocking ambition. The controlling person grows irritated by your independence. Pressure reveals psychology. It always does. Most relationships do not end when respect disappears. They begin changing when awareness appears. And awareness is powerful, because once you start seeing people clearly, it becomes difficult to return to the innocence you once had. After a certain point, human behavior stops surprising you. Not because people become better, but because you begin recognizing the patterns hidden beneath their actions. The compliment that carries a hint of envy, the concern that quietly masks control, the loyalty that exists only while you remain non-threatening. Human interaction starts feeling layered, almost like two conversations happening at the same time. The spoken conversation and the psychological conversation underneath it. Someone says they support your dream, yet their energy changes the moment you become consistent. At first, your ambition entertained them because it felt distant, a possibility, a fantasy, a temporary phase. But consistency changes everything. Consistency is evidence, And evidence makes people uncomfortable, because once discipline becomes visible, excuses begin collapsing around it. People can comfortably ignore potential. They struggle to ignore results. That is why some people secretly prefer watching you struggle. Your struggle protects their self-image. If you fail, their lack of action feels justified. If you succeed, the stories they tell themselves begin falling apart. And human beings often defend those stories far more aggressively than they realize. Many of the qualities people criticize most intensely in others are often reflections of conflicts they have never resolved within themselves. Very rarely does insecurity announce itself honestly. It hides behind judgment. That is why ambition is often criticized as arrogance. Boundaries are labeled coldness. Self-respect is mistaken for ego. By giving something a negative label, people create psychological permission to reject it. Pay attention when your life starts improving. Some people will celebrate your progress publicly while quietly hoping your momentum fades in private. Not because they are evil, but because envy is older than reason, and envy rarely appears in obvious forms. Sometimes it looks sad, sometimes distant, sometimes strangely quiet. A friend grows colder after your success. A partner becomes irritated as your confidence increases. Someone begins making small jokes about your discipline. Tiny moments, but deeply revealing ones. Human beings compare themselves to each other constantly, even when they pretend they do not. Comparison is woven into identity itself, and comparison becomes painful when someone nearby breaks through limitations you still obey. That is why silence becomes more than a strategy. It becomes a filter. The less you announce, the more genuine people's reactions become. They can only respond to reality instead of performance. And reality reveals everything over time. The people who genuinely support you remain steady, even when your growth becomes impossible to ignore. Others reveal discomfort more gradually, a delayed reply after good news, less enthusiasm than before, a subtle emotional distance. The mind notices these things instinctively, even when you try to dismiss them. That uncomfortable feeling around certain people after you begin evolving is often your nervous system recognizing something before your conscious mind can explain it. Human beings communicate emotionally long before they communicate verbally. The energy changes first, the words arrive later, and eventually you realize something unsettling. Many relationships survive not because of deep connection, but because both people unconsciously agree to remain the same. The moment one person changes seriously, tension enters the relationship. Not everyone wants to grow alongside you. Some only wanted a version of you they could predict, a version that felt familiar. That realization can harden people if they are not careful. Because once you begin seeing manipulation, projection, envy, and hidden motives, trust becomes more difficult. You start questioning smiles, questioning praise, questioning intentions, and slowly, isolation begins feeling safer than connection. That is where danger appears, because awareness without balance can slowly become paranoia. Many people lose themselves here, not through failure, through overcorrection. After enough disappointment, hidden resentment, or betrayal, a person begins withdrawing emotionally from the world. They stop sharing, stop trusting, stop allowing anyone close enough to affect them. At first, this feels empowering. Silence becomes armor. Detachment becomes identity. You convince yourself that needing nobody makes you untouchable. But protection can quietly become a prison. A person who trusts nobody eventually loses the ability to experience genuine connection, and that creates a different kind of emptiness. The dangerous part is that society often mistakes emotional numbness for strength. The silent man, the unreadable woman, the person who appears unaffected by everything. Yet many emotionally detached people are not at peace. They are simply exhausted by disappointment, exhausted by social performance, exhausted by learning how conditional human behavior can sometimes be. So they retreat inward, and eventually silence begins revealing something unexpected. Not just the world, but themselves, their envy, their ego, their need for validation, their hidden desire to be admired by the same people they claim not to care about. That is an uncomfortable truth many ambitious people never confront. Even independent people often imagine being witnessed, being recognized, becoming undeniable, making everyone regret underestimating them. But success driven by revenge is still dependence. If your ambition exists primarily to prove something to others, then those people still influence your life far more than you think. Real power begins when your actions no longer require an audience. That is rare, because human beings naturally seek recognition. Even suffering can become performance. People broadcast heartbreak, display loneliness, turn personal growth into content before the transformation has fully happened. The modern world often rewards visibility more than substance, and little by little, many people lose touch with their private identity. Everything becomes external. Curated personalities, manufactured authenticity, public healing, public ambition. Yet the deepest psychological shifts often happen invisibly. No announcement, no validation, no applause, just a quiet internal decision that changes the direction of an entire life. Most people never notice these moments in others because real transformation begins silently. The physical results appear months later. The discipline becomes visible years later. The emotional distance from unhealthy relationships happens long before anyone understands why you left. And this creates an interesting paradox. The more focused a person becomes, the less they feel compelled to explain themselves. Because explanation is often an unconscious search for permission, and people searching for permission rarely create extraordinary change. Observe highly disciplined individuals closely. Many move quietly, not because they fear attention, but because they understand something important. The more people observe your unfinished evolution, the more external influence begins interfering with internal momentum. Opinions distort clarity. Validation weakens hunger. Exposure creates pressure, and pressure changes behavior. A person being watched starts thinking about perception rather than purpose. That is why some dreams die the moment they become public. Not because of bad luck, but because attention divides focus. Eventually, you begin understanding why certain individuals throughout history protected their inner world so carefully. Not because they disliked people, but because they understood people. They understood that most individuals interpret your transformation through the limits of their own psychology. A fearful person sees risk everywhere. An insecure person sees arrogance in confidence. A dependent person sees abandonment in boundaries. And someone unwilling to change often sees your growth as a threat rather than an invitation. People rarely see you as you truly are. They see themselves reflected through you. Once you realize this, you stop explaining every decision and seeking approval before acting. Growth rarely comes from consensus. It comes from stepping away from comfort, old habits, and sometimes even old identities. People often choose familiar suffering over uncertain change. A toxic relationship feels safer than loneliness. An unfulfilling life feels safer than risk. We adapt quickly to psychological cages, especially the cage of social expectations. Others become attached to who they think you are. When you change, they resist. Not because they hate you, but because fixed identities feel comfortable. Yet growth always looks like change. The insecure become confident. The people-pleaser sets boundaries. The quiet person finds their voice. As you evolve, relationships change. Some people loved your availability more than your authenticity. The moment you stop sacrificing yourself for acceptance, some connections fade. Most of this happens unconsciously. People naturally protect their ego and avoid what challenges it. That's why self-awareness is rare. It requires facing uncomfortable truths about jealousy, fear, validation, and control. Real growth means letting go of old survival patterns. What once protected you can eventually imprison you. Becoming yourself often feels lonely because fewer people understand your choices. Many support your growth only until it affects them. When your self-respect rises, some people respect you more, while others become uncomfortable because confidence exposes their insecurities. Awareness changes everything. Once you recognize manipulation, projection, and fake intimacy, you stop tolerating them. You also realize that the flaws you see in others exist within you too. The difference is whether you're conscious of them. Most lives don't lose direction through catastrophe, but through small compromises made to fit in. Over time, people betray themselves until they feel successful on the outside, but empty within. This is why silence matters. Silence reveals hidden truths. It shows where you're seeking validation and where fear is guiding your decisions. At first, it's uncomfortable, then freeing. Eventually, you stop asking permission to become who you are. Your energy becomes focused. Your relationships become selective. You stop announcing every plan because you understand that real growth happens quietly. Roots grow in darkness. Strength develops in silence. Many people seek attention before mastery, but constant exposure can trap them in an image they feel forced to maintain. Meanwhile, those who truly transform often do so quietly, building while others are talking. Silence is not hiding, it is clarity. When you're secure in your direction, you no longer need everyone to understand it. You realize that most opinions are projections anyway, and perhaps the most powerful realization is this: the less you perform for others, the more clearly you see them. Because when you stop seeking attention, human nature becomes impossible to ignore.